is religion, scripture, and the hermeneutics of justice. It actually makes a distinction between the hermeneutics of law, maybe, and the hermeneutics of justice, opposing them, I would say, in a very interesting way. So the scripture, if you like, is where our laws are embedded traditionally. Many scriptures in which laws are embedded. And as I came into the room, we were listening to a lecture on the Quran and what it has to say about the hijab and the discussions that would ensue about it. But I'm interested this morning in how we read the law, or how we read the scripture, or for that matter, how we read any text. You know, I'm a teacher of literature, so I like always to think about how you read a literary text. How do you read a text? How do you read the Bible? How do you read the Quran, and so on? And what are some of the issues that have come up today in terms of reading and justice? Reading, interpreting, and pursuing the call of justice. I want to begin with what has now become a defining text in legal studies. It's by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who is an important philosopher of language, but also towards the end of his life took up many issues that have to deal with racism, the environment, gender issues, not just women's issues, but gender issues and so on. And I want to focus especially on one essay in which Derrida reflects on the relationship between law and justice. Now we tend to think that the courts are the places of justice. Courts of law are also the places of justice. And his whole reflection gives us a way of creating a tension between these two things rather than equating them. Not equating the law and justice, but looking at what could be the tension between law and justice. Well, a first premise is something like this. The law is like scripture, for that matter any other text. We can only know it through our readings of it, all right? The word itself does not mean anything. You have to read the word. And the word releases its meanings through our readings of it. So we can either ignore the reading and concentrate only on the word as if the word itself was motionless, or we look at multiple readings, which you as scholars know you have to do all the time, right? You would go back to look, what did so-and-so say, what was said historically, what was said in the 16th century, 17th century, what did so-and-so say, what did so-and-so say. So one thing you can say that there is a text and then there are readings of it. And in fact, in my classes, there was usually someone who would get up and say, but ma'am, what is the true reading? What is the real reading of this text? Okay? What is the truth? And you know that in religious readings of texts, this is a constant demand. What is the truth? Tell us the truth. And one of the things that Derrida is saying is that the truth is never available to us in that sense, as truth. The truth becomes available. The truth becomes apparent to us only in the face of a call for justice. There has to be a call for justice with which we read the law or we read the scripture. or we read a literary text. And it is in response to this call for justice that the truth must open, transform itself in order to address the call for justice. So the call for justice is always in excess of the text. It's outside the text. It is in the story of Kafka, the man from the country who comes to the door of the law and stands there and wants to get in. But the law will never let him in that story, and I'll come back to why that is so, why the law never lets him in. So there is a sense in which the law is inert, dead, until there is a call for justice that speaks to this law, all right? In the women's movement, we came as women and we said to the law, what have you got to say to us? Why were we excluded? What happened to this, this, and this, and this? And it was a demand for justice that we made to the law. Now, says Derrida, the demand for justice cannot just be derived from the law. You cannot say, this is the truth, and from this truth you can find the answer to your demand for justice. The real demand for justice disturbs the law. It sets the law in some kind of quandary or a tizzy. It requires of the law that the law rearrange itself. A call for justice that can just be derived from the law is just an act of policing. It does not require a judge or a judgment or a theologian to who reads the scripture. Right? It just, the policeman can tell you, you have parked your car in the wrong place, this is your fine. There is no issue of justice there. There's just the law in its most mundane and literal and meaningless form. But the call for justice, says Derrida, can be responded to in two ways by the law. One way is for a judge or whoever is reading the scripture or reading the literary text to back off and want to conserve the law, to defend himself or herself against the call for justice. To say, no, this is what the law is, and this is what the law will remain. This is what the law has to. So that is the moment of the conservative reading of the law in relation. It refuses the call for justice. And it turns back on itself in order to conserve the law. Now, in religious circles, this is a very, very common action. You know that those in charge of theological texts or the scriptures feel they know the law. They've studied it. Sure they do. They are experts in the law. But remember, this question of justice is always in excess of the law. It requires that the law reach beyond itself in order to address something it has never heard of before, never seen before. The law must extend to listen to this new requirement of justice. Now, what this philosopher does is to create a tension between these two concepts. In common parlance, we think of law and justice as somehow equal. There's courts of law, there are places of justice, right? They're all the same. But Derrida creates a rift, if you like, of kinds between these two notions. That the law is always inadequate to the new call for justice. It is, the call for justice requires of the law that the law read itself. Next step in this argument. So Derrida says, there are two ways in which the law can respond. The law can, in fear, turn back on itself. Can say, I do not want to listen to you, or I will provide a reading of the law that will conserve the law against this new demand for justice. Or, and this is the second aspect that is most interesting for me, or the law can say, I have to open myself to this new demand for justice. And some writers have called this opening an opening to the messianic, the Messiah. What is interesting about the Messiah, I'm not a theologian, but I think that what is most interesting about the Messiah is the Messiah comes from outside. He doesn't come from where you expect. He doesn't come from the courts of authority. He's not a priest already. You know where the Christian Messiah was born and where he comes from the most humble authorities. And the Messiah comes in with a question, if you like, that requires the law to rearrange itself, to completely transform itself. That's the meaning of the Messiah. It's from the outside, and it will change the inside. It has to change the inside in order to listen to the messianic or the call for justice. The inside must transform itself. So in response to the call for justice, the judge can do two things. One, the judge can allow himself to reread the law in terms of this new call. Or second, the judge can reread, he has to reread the law. He can reread the law in order to preserve the old framework of the law. Okay. And so you have a conservative justice and a messianic justice. That which will conserve and that which will be open to the Messiah. Derrida himself doesn't use this term messianic, though he quotes two thinkers who do use the term as the messianic, as that which comes from the outside, not necessarily as a person or a whatever, but a voice, a truth, a question, a demand, a complaint that comes in from the outside and breaks the system. But he makes use of this idea that the call for justice or the demand for justice is entirely outside the structure of the law. And the structure of the law must reinvent itself in order to address this. So I want to give you two examples or explore two recent, my notes. Both the law that bends towards justice has to be read in order to bend towards justice. And the law that refuses this new claim for justice and turns back on itself, that is also a new reading of the law. So it's not that one is an application of the law and one is a reading. Both the conservative and the revolutionary are readings of the law. No one has access to the law or to the scripture in itself. Right? No one, not even the Pope or whoever else is the expert in theology. No one of any text. That is always open to further interpretation and to further be open to this knock at the door of the law, which is the knock of justice. The two examples that I wanted to think about. I'm sorry I missed the presentation where I know most of it, but I listened very attentively to the presentation on the hijab that preceded this. And I was interested to see what the Quranic injunctions or the interpretation of the Quranic injunctions on this were. Very modern interpretations. But let me start with another controversy. And that is a controversy that is raging now even as students are coming back from Ukraine and was raging 2 or 3 months ago when the examinations were taking place. It's a controversy of NEET, which is the National Entrance Examination for admission into medical colleges. Now you know, admission into medical colleges, it used to be IIT was the biggest thing, but now NEET is the biggest thing. Every student is trying to pass NEET, takes a year off, studies hard, does this, does the other thing, drinks Horlicks, I don't know what else, you know, in order to be able to crack NEET. Now NEET has been described by many states as the most unjust of examinations. So let me take you through the history of NEET in order to understand why NEET was set up and why the Supreme Court thought that this was the right answer to the problems that existed. And why is it that so many states consider it so unjust? What is that call for justice that comes from these states? So NEET was set up, a lot of young people here, so they may not all know this story. NEET was set up because after the opening of many private medical colleges, Karnataka took the lead, but everywhere else it happened. Rajasthan, I think Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab. There are certain places where a large number were opened up. And these private medical colleges admitted people who could pay the fees. So we all laughed at Dalits who had come into the courses through reservation, but these students who came in only by paying money continued to keep their honor and their merit and so on alive. There was a big problem. The medical colleges began charging higher and higher fees because people were willing to pay 1 crore, 2 crore, 3 crore, I don't know what they were willing to pay, because they saw this medical education as an investment which would bring good returns. It's the beginning of the commercialization of medicine in a big way. And to make matters worse, it wasn't just the fees. You had to pay another capitation fee. Do you remember? Some of you remember this? That you had to pay a capitation fee in order to get in, and then you had to pay this high fees. Now again, there were people, and you can guess who these people are. They're mostly from the cities. They have 2 or 3 generations of education and commercial or investment in commerce. The people with investment in commerce, by and large, don't come into medicine or engineering, and they continue in the commercial line. So it is the academic castes, if you like, who come into studying medicine and engineering and all these things. So people who could afford to pay for a medical seat, paid for the medical seat, and then it didn't matter what your marks were. Now this was considered enormously unjust by the relatively poorer people like you and me, who have 2 or 3 generations of education, who are quite well off, and who think that's not fair. Our children are brighter than these children. Just because we can't afford the fees doesn't mean that they should not have admission into medical colleges. Fees should be regulated, and entrance should be regulated. So they went to court, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. The Supreme Court said this has become a business, this is not allowed, medicine is a calling, there should be a level playing field where there's a single entrance examination, and the fees should be controlled. There should be some control over the fees. Now, if you couldn't admit anyone who had enough money and you had to admit people who passed the examination, it was not possible to charge so much money. So this is the story of NEET, if you like. But when NEET came into practice, there were some places that were totally against it. And the most interesting place that was against it is Tamil Nadu. Now Tamil Nadu, most of you would know, is one of the most amazing places in the whole world as far as political theory goes. It is a place that has created a social revolution with which it entered modernity. Usually it is an industrial revolution or a political revolution that brings modernity. Tamil Nadu creates a social revolution that creates modernity. It is among the most highly educated populations. Everybody, 100% of Tamil Nadu children have passed the SSLC examination. Okay? Or maybe it's 99.96 or something like that. Tamil Nadu also has one of the best primary healthcare systems in India. Over 75% of Tamil Nadu's primary health centers are serviced by 2 doctors. The other 25% or 24% have only 1 doctor, but they have 1 doctor. Of this 75%, one of the 2 doctors, in 72%, one of the 2 doctors is a woman. Now when you look at these figures, you know what a democratic system it is. That it includes a widely educated population. It includes people who will work in primary health centers, in small towns and in rural areas, and are willing to serve in those places. The reason is very clear, because they are connected to those places in some ways, or they have some relationship with them, or they are interested for other reasons in serving in those places, maybe their commitment to something, whether it's medicine or it is to some religious formation. But you still have an ideology in place, as well as a politics in place, that allows these people to go out and serve in the PMCs. Now, this is not paralleled. In some south, in Karnataka to a certain extent, and in Kerala to a certain extent, we have this. But it's not parallel anywhere else in India. The rural health centers do not get doctors. So what has happened? How does the story go ahead? Tamil Nadu said, with this system, you are going to fill all the government hospitals with people from the towns, urban centers, who have the opportunity to study in coaching colleges for the NEET examination. The NEET is an all-India examination. It is to be written in English. It does not follow the state syllabus. It is not enough to do the SSLC in order to get in on the NEET. And it creates a structure of privilege for the city-bred, English medium educated, central syllabus, CBSE or ISC syllabus oriented students. Students who studied in Tamil medium or Malayalam medium or Telugu medium are disadvantaged by NEET. And NEET therefore gets young people into medicine whose main aim is to get this degree and get out of the country. Okay. If you think I'm being unfair, please look at the statistics. Indian doctors and nurses service the entire world. We have a cadre of medical people which is unparalleled in any other country. When the war started in Ukraine, we were all so surprised to find. Were you surprised? So many Indian students there. And what were they all studying? Medicine. I wonder whether there was one student studying theology. They were all studying medicine, and this is true of the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, China, many other Eastern European countries. There are people even who go, not Cuba so much, but go to Brazil to study medicine. Now medicine is obviously a pain. It's worthwhile to study medicine, Not because you want to serve the poor or that you want to heal the sick, but because you invest the money and the investment pays back. So what has happened? The young man who died in Ukraine, do you remember him, where he came from? Karnataka. All right. And his father said, I had to send him to Ukraine because though he got 97% in the school leaving examinations, he could not possibly write NEET. Okay? NEET is totally biased against the kind of people who populate the Tamil Nadu primary healthcare system. And so Tamil Nadu as a state appealed against NEET, and from 2013 onwards until now, it is 9 years later, it has continued to do so, and it has made small advances. They allowed some reservation. First, there was no reservation. It was pure, quote unquote, you know what's the word that's inside the quotes? No reservations, pure merit. Okay. And we all know now, I hope we all know, what merit means after I've given you that long example of what goes into making merit. No. And then slowly the Supreme Court said, yes, you can have so many percent for SC/STs, you can have so many OBCs, etc., etc. There were small concessions. But the court attended to the call for justice by conserving its idea of merit, retaining it in a way that undercut all the work that states like Tamil Nadu had done over many decades to reach out to their populations and to make education of all kinds available to them. Only into this year, 2022, and you can see I'm one of those people who are very interested in what happens to reservations and education and so on. The Supreme Court, one of the more advanced or more liberal judges in the Supreme Court, finally reads a book that was written in the 1980s. And this is a book by Pierre Bourdieu, who writes about, calls it distinction. What is distinction? That is, what constitutes the special, the person who stands out. And we all think that it's brains that constitute distinction. And Pierre Bourdieu showed, by doing a lot of empirical studies, that all the people who were considered distinguished or to have distinction, a huge, overwhelmingly large percentage came from already distinguished classes. In other words, what we considered as distinction was privilege. Very simple. It's not capability, it's not intelligence, it is privilege. And we have an examination, it was an examination system and many other examination systems around the country that reproduces privilege. And the call for justice against NEET in places like Tamil Nadu have been calls for having a local examination which is written in a local language. You study in a village school, you study in Tamil or you study in Telugu, and you should be able to write the examination in Tamil or Telugu or Manipuri or Nagamese. There is no reason why this should not be so. All these languages are equally equipped to do anything. So first is, the examination should be in the language that is studied in school, not in English. And the second demand is just two simple demands. The second demand is that it should be based not on the CBSE syllabus, which is only studied in towns and in central schools and so on, not on the CBSE syllabus, but on the state board syllabus. So that a student who had been through school and had studied well could do well in the medical entrance exams. exams. They were not saying don't have exams, just admit through reservation. They were saying let's have this exam, but let's have a just exam. But this call for justice took many, many years and many, many rounds at the Supreme Court, which is full of people who are very learned in the books of law, but could not hear the call for justice. Okay. And even today, we continue to have a medical entrance examination that is very biased against the very people who should be entering that system and serving the really badly served people in small towns and rural areas who have almost no medical facilities available to them. So that's the story of NEET. How do examinations, why do you have so much faith in examinations, in merit? How do you ask the question of justice against these ideas of merit or these medical seats or engineering seats that are reserved for a small privileged group in our society? Okay, the reservation works in the opposite way. They're not reserved for SC/ST or OBC or women. They are reserved for a small group of privileged men in this society. So these are the questions that need to be addressed, that NEET brings up. And in a sense, NEET is so important because it allows us to ask the question of caste, mainly the question of caste domination in our society. The urban centers are dominated by the dominant castes, what used to be called the upper caste, but these are the dominant castes, and the rural areas by OBCs, SCs, STs, and so on. And the division is one that has become so apparent in the battles over NEET. Let me move on to a brief discussion of this new issue that is before us, the hijab issue. Now, I'm not a scholar of the Quran, neither am I a person who has been very involved in these issues, so I am an onlooker, but I'm an onlooker who has tried to learn through these current debates. I've been very interested in learning, and I've been very interested in listening to young Muslim women and what they have to say about this discussion. I'm not interested so much in listening to the learned lawyers or judges and so on. What are the young Muslim women saying? Well, one thing they are all making very clear is this demand for justice that they have put up is a demand for justice that is not a question of whether it is legal or not in Islamic law. It's not just that. All right. And you know, as we heard as I came in, that scholars are completely disagreed about whether this is Quranic or not, or that hijab is required. And some countries in the world Muslim countries require the hijab, other countries don't require the hijab. Some scholars say it is necessary, other scholars say it's not. There's no agreement. But there's one thing on which I think all Muslims are in agreement, or 95 or 97% of Muslims would be in agreement, and many Christians would also be in agreement, that this is a question that has to be seen in the context of the harassment of minorities in this country. That's the framework. It's not the framework of what a woman can wear, whether she has the freedom to choose and so on. The framework that has to be used to look at it is the framework of the harassment of minorities. So one young woman said to me, just over the last 2 years, every 3 months there is a new issue we have to worry about. First it is super spreaders, then it is love jihad, then it is now hijab. So what are these issues? What are they trying to do? These are issues that place this minority on the back foot, push it into the defensive, create a kind of public opinion against it. So, now, what is the framework? So there's an issue. How does the law look at it? What is the framework in which the laws look at it? What is the framework of justice to this issue? Well, the Karnataka High Court chose to conserve the law. It made the most banal and impoverished reading of the law that was possible. It said, the Constitution does not support this, you are not allowed to bear it. I don't know, I'm fairly sure that among middle class people like you and me, a very large proportion will consider the hijab an unnecessary thing. Why are they wearing it? Why are they creating this nuisance? What is the point of this? Why can't the women be free? Well, do you ever ask that question about men who cover their legs? Alright. Would you come into this room with your lungi tied up? Would you come into this room wearing a lungi? Would you come into this room with your lungi tied up at half-mast? Alright. As soon as you see a senior person or a woman, you would drop it. What are these conventions of modesty, respect, self-presentation? What are these conventions that we have to look at in order to understand? Would you ask a woman to remove her dupatta? Why do college uniforms not all include a hijab? We all have, every single uniform would have salwar kameez and dupatta. Earlier it used to be in some places a long skirt and a half sari. Or if we wear a sari, we always have a palla. So whether you're a man or you're a woman, there are certain conventions of dressing that you consider decorous, acceptable, that make you feel comfortable, that allow you to move into the public sphere. And these are conventions. But they are conventions that come with in every society, and they are conventions that are built into our psyches. You would not be able to come into this room, or if you came into this room with your mundu tied up, madaki kutti enna parayunnathu in Malayalam, tied up, you would be regarded as impolite, unacceptable in this society. It would not be the correct thing to do. And even without thinking, you would drop your own. Right? You would not wear shorts into an assembly like this. And so on. Now, there's nothing wrong. You can wear shorts. It's not an impossible thing. And some rebellious young man may want to do it. But it is not the generally acceptable thing, and it is not what would make most people feel comfortable. It's the feeling comfortable. So if you have grown up wearing a hijab, and you have grown up in a Muslim family where everybody wears a hijab, and you've grown up in a Muslim society where the hijab is to take off the hijab. Do you remember how the hijab was pulled off these women, teachers and students who came in? What happened to your heart when that happened, when you saw that taking place? Did you want to hide your face in shame at what India was doing to its own citizens, stripping them in public? Okay? So the hijab is that which is deeply tied in with your style of dress, what you like to wear. Like you wear a sari. Why do you wear a sari? You can easily wear jeans. Can't you? Yeah? Why not? Why couldn't I have worn jeans and come here? I can't. I would not have done it. Right? It would not be comfortable or appropriate. So what these young girls are saying is, one, this has to be judged in terms of the historical moment in India. Don't judge this simply as a question of reading the Quran. You have to read the Quran in this historical moment. And you have to engage the politics of this historical moment. The second thing they're saying, and I can circulate this absolutely wonderful video in which there are two of them speaking, one who wears the hijab and one who doesn't wear the hijab, both of them PhD students, both of them studying, yes, abroad. And so one question was that of the moment. So a judge who looks at this cannot just say, I will read the Constitution and look at the letter of the Constitution. He has to look at that Constitution to say, what does it say to the current moment? What does it say to this present issue of justice that has come to us? It has to be a new reading of the Constitution. And he failed. That Karnataka High Court failed to read it anew, failed to attend to the question of justice that was coming up before it. The justice of the education of these girls, the justice against stripping people and shaming them in public. The second question, how did he read the law? Did he lean towards the question? Did he open his ears and bend down to hear the demand for justice? Or did he turn his back on the demand for justice and open his big book? He turned his back on the demand for justice and opened his big book. And the sad part is that so many of us are convinced by his action. We feel that that is the correct way of reading the law, the one that conserves the law, shuts out the new questions that are coming before it, and holds the law in some kind of frozen conservatism. So it's not frozen actually, that's the wrong metaphor that I've used. He actually rereads the law in order to refuse these new questions that have come before. So let me conclude. Both these cases that I've looked at, both these examples, are examples of very current, everything that's happened in the last 5 or 6 months, if you like, current issues that have come up before us as questions of justice. Have we, as thinking human beings sitting in this room, have we extended ourselves to the questions of justice that have come up in these 2 years? What have we changed? Have we thought about them? Have we listened to the call that is there? Or are we repeating the old law, the reading of the law that will conserve it, that will repeat, that will tell you, I belong to a feminist group, and there's always a battle in that group that is taking place now. Yes, the students should, their education should not be, but do they have to insist on wearing the hijab? And the court must not say that hijab is essential to Islam, because I want my freedom not to wear the hijab. Now, all these are questions. I don't say they're not questions, but they are not the questions of justice at this moment. The questions of justice at this moment have to be in the larger frame of what is happening to minorities, and that includes you and me. What is happening to minorities in this country? That is number one. And number two, can you strip a woman in public? Can you strip anyone in public? And more so, can you strip? For men, the question of shame is less than the question of shame for women. Can you strip a woman in public?
Questions? Yes. Thank you, Professor Susie Tharu. It was an interesting demonstration of how law can be interpreted, redefined in various contexts. To summarize, the inadequacy of the law is reflected in a fresh demand for justice, is the essence that she was explaining to us. Law cannot be canonized like how we canonize the scriptures. It has to rearrange itself, it has to reinvent itself. The Pharisaic reading of law, like how Pharisees used to read the law by letter, I think that needs to be put down, and we need to place the law in various contexts and try to interpret the law to liberate people. She presented two issues, including NEET and the hijab. The NEET issue was very interesting because she was mentioning about Tamil Nadu, how it is trying to work with the two issues of equity and equality. When it comes to equity, which I feel, in my administration, I feel, when I discuss with other principals, we see that sometimes we go with meritocracy, do not own the college, do not own the country, they simply fly off. But the Hyderabad Christian College believes in not only in absolute meritocracy, but we also use our discretion. We admit downtrodden people, and we see that those students who are admitted based on equity principle, they own the college, they own the country. And we see this, and I was just reflecting on this aspect when she was explaining this particular context of equity. And CBSE and the other kinds of syllabus that we have now, people who have privileges, they go to the tuition centers and finally they get through NEET. And I always see that in the case of admissions, there should be multiple windows. There was an issue called joint admission test in IIT JAM. Many of you might know the issues, I do not know because we are closely associated with that, where we find that when JAM was conducted in a centralized way, initially there were a lot of issues. One particular region used to crack the JAM and come to Tamil Nadu and they get admitted to IIT Madras. So there was a lot of rift. And later, they wanted to conduct the JAM in different places by passing the papers to different, the examiners in different states. There exactly the same problem arose. And one thing we found, all those students who got educated from IIT Madras, where I did my PhD, I found from my professor saying that the guy who completed MSc Chemistry did not use this knowledge for wealth creation. Rather, he went off to something else, not even bothered about his own alma mater. This is normalization. We tried normalization. I think I was really reflecting on the issues that I was going through. Reservation is about equity, the caste domination that she was mentioning about. The common entrance test that probably would also be extended to arts and science colleges as per the new education policy would definitely do the same harm as we find in the NEET case. I hope you know that the common entrance test would be conducted for all liberal arts and science colleges, and where the downtrodden will not be able to get admitted in education institutions. That's issue number one. And the second issue that she was mentioning about hijab is we have to look from the perspective of harassment of minority. And it's really interesting that when we deal with legal issues, with the available interpretation or the letter that we have, legal definitions, we are not able to find solutions for many issues in my administration. So I used to think that we have to think law from a framework point and try to reinvent, and this is how court direction comes into the picture. When we are not able to solve a given issue by the law, we go to the court and ask the judge to interpret it, reinvent it for a given context and try to solve the issue. So I understood from this that place the law in various contexts where justice demands law to liberate us. Thank you, madam, for a wonderful exposition on the two scenarios of law and justice. Now, we can have 5 minutes for interactions. If you would like to ask any questions, please go ahead.